Hey, it's Mendel. Today, we're unlocking one of the conversations from our bonus feed. That's where we release exclusive bits of audio to all of our supporters on Patreon and Apple Podcasts. There's a whole back catalog of silly mini episodes, long-form extended interviews with guests from the main feed, and a bunch of entirely new, fascinating conversations you won't hear anywhere else. It's one of the ways we say thanks for helping us make the show. We really can't do it without you. You can get access to the bonus feed and more for less than the price of a cup of coffee at patreon.com/Future Ecologies. In this conversation, building on episode 6.2, I speak with Skye Augustine, a leading voice uplifting the science, history, and culture of sea gardens. In a time where so much of the future feels uncertain, the resiliency of sea gardens over millennia is, at least to me, a source of deep comfort and inspiration. What's more, if you're as inspired as I am and you want to learn how your community could build a sea garden, we've got you covered. Head to patreon.com/Future Ecologies and sign up as a free member, where you'll get access to my interview with Joe Williams, the community shellfish liaison for the Swinomish Indian tribal community, who built the very first clam garden constructed in the modern era. We've made that bonus interview available to the free membership tier at patreon.com/Future Ecologies. Of course, if you can chip in a bit to keep us going, we deeply appreciate it. We remain proudly independent and ad-free, thanks to the support of listeners like you. Okay, it's time to dive in even deeper with Skye Augustine. Enjoy. Whenever I talk with people about sea gardens, one name comes up more than any other, and that's yours. Could I get you to introduce yourself?
Ait sgwel einta Hwestianyan Tnitsanalstaminas. My name is Skye Augustine. My Hokaminam name is Hwestianyan, and I'm from the Chemainus First Nation. I'm the daughter of Swialt and the granddaughter of Quatlamat and the great-granddaughter of Edith Sylvie on my mother's side. And on my father's side, I am of settler ancestry. My father is of Swedish, primarily, descent. Yeah, and I grew up, the great fortune of growing up in the Cowichan Valley in the homelands of my mother and my mother's family, and have had this incredible opportunity to be a continuous learner and facilitator of clam garden and sea garden restoration for the bulk of my adult life.
How do you like to introduce the concept of sea gardens and clam gardens to people who've never heard about it before?
Clam gardens are these incredible beaches that have been managed by our ancestors since time immemorial, or for many, many thousands of years. And they're very unique to this part of the coast. They can only exist in the way that they do here in particular tidal ranges. And they are places that are characterized by a rock wall that is at the low tide of the beach, and it creates a terrace that is ideal for clams to grow. There are these beaches that are hidden most of the time. If you're really lucky, in some places you will get to see the base of the rock wall at the very, very lowest tides. And so these places were hidden from the human eyes. Ancestrally, they were managed by our elders and our women and our youth. And so one of the reasons that I think clam gardens have captivated people's imaginations and attention is because they weren't recognized by Western scientists or settlers for a really long time.
How did this sort of modern awareness of sea gardens and clam gardens come to be?
Yeah, clam gardens weren't recognized by Western scientists for a long time. But this technology and this knowledge, and in some cases, teachings and ceremonies related to these places have remained in our communities. They just haven't been more broadly acknowledged or talked about. And so in the late 90s and early 2000s, a coastal geomorphologist, John Harper, and biologist Mary Morris were doing aerial surveys of the British Columbia coastline in the development of an oil spill response plan. And when they were flying over Kwakwaka'wakw territory, they were noticing all of these rock walls that lined the low tide. And when they went and visited these beaches, they saw all sorts of clams. Now, when they talked to provincial archaeologists and experts about these places, they were told that there were no such thing as technologies or modifications for shellfish. And so it started a long period of them feeling like they were aware of this type of technology and that was human generated that nobody else was acknowledging. John and Mary had been talking to people and trying to learn more about these incredible beaches that they had been seeing. And it was in the 2000s that they got put in touch with Clan Chief Adam Dick Quaxistala. He had actually built clam gardens as a child with his grandparents. And so when they first arrived to ask questions, I've been told that he said, "Why are these people coming to ask about our lohiwe? Why are these people showing me these photos of our lohiwe?" And it was Quaxistala who translated these places. He said, "These are our lohiwe," or "These are our clam gardens." And so the reason that we call these rock wall features clam gardens is because that is how Quaxistala translated the Kwakwala term lohiwe to English during those initial conversations with John and Mary. And so it's been since then that the awareness of just how prolific clam gardens are and the tremendous resilience and care that has been put into these beaches, but not only these beaches, but entire landscapes. And I think that the growing awareness of clam gardens has been a really important part of a conversation more generally around how our people have cultivated and stewarded our relationship with our territories and the territories that look after us and all of our more than human kin for thousands of years. One of the things that I think is so powerful about this shift in conversation is that the entire basis for the doctrine of discovery and the existence of settler states in North America is based upon the idea that these lands were not being used to their fullest extent. And through the perceived absence of agriculture and aquaculture as European lenses we're used to seeing it. So when we start to recognize that we have these technologies and spaces that are governed by complex governance regimes and are stewarding and managing these resources in ways that modify the productivity and allow continuous harvest for multiple millennia without any evidence of fishing down a food chain. I have yet to see any other types of modern technologies that are sustainable in this kind of way. And so I'm really excited about how work on clam gardens and sea gardens is allowing our ideas around what innovation is and around how we can support food security and food sovereignty in this changing world in the future can really look to the past and learn so many lessons around what it means to relate more fully with our foods in the system and be as part of the systems that our foods come from.
Mm-hmm. And the walls themselves are part of that technology, as well as the cultural practices that accompany them. How do those two things fit together?
So one thing that we know about clam gardens is that they function best when humans are a part of them. There's a whole suite of different tending practices that you must take if you want a clam garden to flourish. And for people who have spent time on the land terrestrially and might garden, I think you can imagine when you're trying to grow a food, there's a lot of love and care that you can give to that food and the soil and all of the other elements that can really contribute to that food's flourishing and the flourishing of that whole system. And so in some ways, that is really similar to clam gardens. And so clam gardens work best when we are able to harvest some of the clams, when we take out the big ones and we put back the small ones, when we are able to eat some of the other species that eat clams. And one of the things that's really important when you're looking after a clam garden is making sure that you are feeding not just the humans, but all of the other relatives that make their home in these sea gardens and around these sea gardens as well. And so making sure that there's enough clams and that there's enough kelps for your red rock crab and your octopus and all of the other species that are making their homes. If we want to have a really flourishing clam garden or a sea garden, we need to make sure that we have all of those tending practices happen. Now, many of the clam gardens on the coast stopped being heavily managed or cared for incredibly regularly. In different places, it's been at different times, but I think at the earliest we could say was probably the late 1700s or early 1800s, when a lot of our communities were really heavily hit with diseases. And so some of these clam gardens haven't received the type of care or tending that they would have in the past. And when we do ecological experiments on these places that haven't received care, active care for many generations, and say we transplant clams from one place into a beach that is a clam garden and onto a beach that doesn't have a wall, what we find is that those clams continue to grow faster, that the technological legacy that's left has created conditions that continue to support more productivity of clams even 200 years after they've been actively managed. We also see that there are more recruits. We see more little baby clams on clam garden beaches than we do on beaches that haven't received these types of care. And so these are all indications about the ways that these places have continued to look after our people, even when our people have been removed from the system that we are intended to be caretakers of. And so now my research has looked at the restoration of our people's relationship with those places again, and has tried to understand what happens to our beaches and what happens to these ecosystems when we restore and revive those essential connections with those places. And what we've found is that almost immediately, when you think about these places as being thousands of years old, the gardens that I work on one of them is at least 1,000 years old, and one of them is between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. And those gardens, within 1 to 3 years, are seeing dramatic increases to the number of small clams.
That's a blink of an eye.
It is a blink of an eye. Yeah, when you're talking on the span of millennia. And so after 1 year or 3 years of restoring the rock walls, the seeds are being trapped on the beaches again, and the baby clams are able to settle or are able to survive for long enough for us to be able to count them. Mm-hmm. I think that is tremendously hopeful in terms of the recovery of these types of places as food sources for our communities looking into the future. I feel like I continue to be a learner of how to caretake a flourishing sea garden or clam garden. There are many things that are governed by our teachings and our laws that must be in place in order for these places to function really well. And so ancestrally, the ones closest to our village sites were often left for our elders and for times in great need. And younger people would travel to gardens that their families might be looking after, or other clam beaches that were receiving care further away from our homes. And that was in part to make sure that there's always food available. There's always food available even if the storms get really bad. There's food available if we have a bad year for salmon, and there's food available for those who can't make the journey to beaches that are further away. And so some beaches are places that you would just visit certain times of the year, while others would be harvested from and looked after all year round. Some of the really important things that I've learned on my journey are the importance of being in these places and paying close attention. I've been taught about the term Huetnam, which in Hulkaminam means to truly listen. To truly listen with more than just your ears and more than just your eyes, but to let all of your senses be present in this place and watch how the water moves across a beach, how the kelps and the animals change at different tides, to pay attention to how a beach is responding when we are turning it over or we're clearing some of the rocks, because a big part of looking after these places can be very dependent on the systems that can be really unique to the island, to the water systems that are nearby. With such short low tide windows, it can be really easy to try to prioritize all of them to try to get as much work done as you can. And one of the things that I have been often reminded about is the importance of also leaving space for us to build a relationship with these places in ways that might not conventionally feel productive, but that really serve kind of the long-term care. And there's like a whole bunch of other more specific ways that we look after them. So, you pay attention to which animals are influencing a system, and then we have ways of managing some of those interactions. And so sometimes that means excluding predators from certain beaches that are close to your village. And it might mean looking after beaches for your predators in other places. So sometimes it's spatial. Some of the clam gardens in my territory, I like to think of them as these like complex mosaics of different food systems, because they can extend nearly 1 kilometer long, the rock walls themselves. And so you have acres of terrace, and in some parts of the terrace, there are eelgrass beds that have horse clams and Dungeness crab that are living in them. And you have along the rock wall, there are octopus houses that have been built. And you can see evidence of octopus that's been harvesting some of the red rock crab and some of the butter clams. There are other places where there are these ponds that exist at low tide. And in the ponds, there are the giant Pacific sea cucumbers, which are another really important food.
I think that's what I probably saw at Russell Island. Hey, they're like big and red and striated. The thing was large.
Yeah. And they're delicious. And so I think like one of the things that I have come to just admire so much about these, these like dictionaries or playbooks that our ancestors have left us is that, these places aren't just one thing. There are many different species that we're cultivating. And in my territory, sea levels have been rising continuously for over 11,000 years. And so what that means is that my ancestors are used to dealing with sea level rise. It also means that the base of rock walls, the original rocks that my ancestors placed to construct clam gardens, say 4,000 years ago, are no longer ever exposed at the lowest tides of the year. And it means that we get kelp forests that grow along them.
I just wanted to say, I don't know whether I'll keep this in, although I think it'd be cool for people to know. But I want to tell you that speaking of kelp, you haven't heard this version of the episode yet, but there's a couple of thematic pieces of music, which my friend Jonathan Kotchuk and a horn player named Daniel Lapp made with literal horns made from kelp. So that features in the episode. So I'm very excited.
That's so amazing.
Yeah, it sounds incredible.
I bet it does. Kelp forests support baby salmons, and they have chitons that live in them, and kelp crabs and red rock crabs and sea cucumbers and octopus and all sorts of different species. And kelps themselves are also a food. And one of the things that my research has shown is that the kelps that these clam gardens grow are not just a food for humans, they're also a food for the clams. And they're a food for all of the species that eat the clams.
How do the clams eat the kelp?
So as the kelp starts to decay through the year, it gets mixed up into the water column, little bits of the kelp. And so they are filtered by the clams. And that is fueling part of the sea garden system. And so we truly have these multi-species mariculture systems that include humans where everyone's being looked after. And not everyone's looked after in the same way in the same place, but everyone has a home.
That is such a beautiful sentiment. And I find this whole story of clam gardens is so compelling. It's so easy to get excited about from a food security perspective. One thing we didn't talk very much in the episode was also climate adaptation. As these places are becoming more acidified, the presence of the shell hash itself can be a local salve against that acidity, protecting the clams as well. Obviously, like indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. There's so many different ways to get excited about the story. A question that comes up for me is, similar to the sort of the residue of the gardens themselves, where we've inherited a lot of really good and beautiful things. We've also inherited a pretty messed up system overall. Like things have been going wrong for a long time. Where we are now, moving forward, how do you think about, exciting the general population about these things? Is this something where everybody can get involved, or like coastal peoples in general? Can we love these places to death? How do you tango with these kind of delicate issues that we have now?
Oh, I love that question. And before I jump into that, I just want to clarify, because I think the question you brought up about our changing oceans is really important.
Oh, please. Yeah. No, we really didn't spend enough time on that in the episode. So
I think it's really exciting because we have this growing understanding of all the different ways that some of these ancient technologies are able to confer resilience at local scales to some of the conditions that some of these species are most vulnerable to. And so a lot of the focus has still been on clams, but as we know, those are not the only characters who are important parts of these stories. But one of the things that a couple of my colleagues have found, and this work will be published soon, is that clam gardens are able to buffer some of the temperature extremes, and they're able to minimize some of the stress that clams themselves are under when they're experiencing temperatures like we experienced with the 2021 heat dome, for instance. And so I think that's really promising for kind of local resilience. And we don't know yet about the ability of shell to buffer acidity, but I think that is a hypothesis that is really exciting to dig into at some point, because the shell has so many other properties that helps little baby clams know that that's a good place for them to live. It's an appropriate pore size for your sediment so that you're able to maintain a lot of water flow through your beach and therefore a lot of food availability. Disentangling these mechanisms provides more and more excitement for the nerds among us who want to understand exactly how and why these places are just such brilliant innovations that have lasted and sustained for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. But I am curious how you respond, or is it even a worry for you about people getting too excited too fast about these things and rushing into it, or like just from a human population concern, because we have so many more people here than we ever did before? How does that future relationship with these places, especially when you talk about revitalizing them, bringing them back to life, where are you at with that?
I am really excited about how many people are feeling inspired by conversations around how to revitalize their relationship with lands. I think that one of the challenges we see, particularly here where many people feel like they or their families are relative newcomers, is a sense of being a visitor to a place who's not necessarily there to stay. And I think that when you think about being in relationship with a place that your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and your great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren are also going to be in relationship with, that fundamentally changes everything about the way that you're going to want to live and the legacy that you're going to want to leave. And I think it changes the way that we make decisions. I find it really exciting that this kind of conversation has cracked open, because I think that when we talk about revitalizing clam gardens, we're also talking about revitalizing that way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Because clam gardens aren't just a technology for our people. They are this is part of a way of life. And in order to bring them back, we have to bring back that way of life. And, when I think about my community and the incredible shoulders that I get to stand on, I think about the resilience. Like, our people have gone through apocalypse. Like, dramatic changes aren't new to our people. My ancestors and my elders have done an incredible job of prioritizing the care of our ceremonies and of our language in the face of unbelievable odds. And they have gone to such incredible lengths to make sure that that's all gets passed down. And I think that one of the things that excites me is that I feel like this could be part of a next wave of our revival. And so, you know, we have to invest in the care of our elders and the resurgence of our governance practices, because when we govern our lands and our waters the way we need to, it's about making sure that things remain in balance, in perpetuity. That's how you can tell if you're a successful leader in our ways. Is there enough thriving among your people and in all of your more than human relatives in the salmon and in the islands and in the forest that you have enough to give away? And so I think that if we're able to kind of remember that way of thinking, that could go a long way. There were many of our people. People talk about how the population now is so much larger than it was. And I just know that, you know, some of our villages and some of our communities had tremendous numbers of people. You know, it's about the way that we are living with these places.
That fills me with such hope that it is possible. It is possible to be in right relationship even when we are in like big, bountiful communities. And I want to pick up on a word that you used there, because I think different people understand it in different ways, and that is balance, right? I think some people, especially coming from a Western science sort of 20th century idea of balance, as I understand it, in the formation of the science of ecology as we know it today, balance meant a kind of hands-off balance, right? It meant a static balance, that if you had the system, it was in balance and you could leave it alone and that was great, right? And it would just stay that way, perfect. And when I hear you talk about balance and the way of relating to these systems and being a part of them, that's an involved balance. That's an active balance where we keep it in balance. It's a balancing, it's a verb. And I love that so much to not shy away from that, but to like really lean into that.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think that it's a new idea for people because it requires that we remember that we're animals who fundamentally are a part of nature.
Yeah.
And that is unavoidable, and that we have influence over how we are going to relate with nature, that we can't avoid how we're relating, but we can influence how we're relating. And I think that one of the things that, fascinates me is that more and more when we're looking at like kind of the basis of ecology and this idea that to understand how a pristine system functions, you have to understand how it works without humans.
There were air quotes there, in pristine.
Yeah, in pristine systems. You have to understand how that system functions without humans. And in some instances, the places that we have chosen to study ecological processes in the absence of humans are directly in ancient village sites that have had incredible human management that's been sustained for, we're talking upwards of 14,000 years minimum. And so I think that as we change our time scales and as we start to extend those, it requires that we restory our landscapes, because you have to fill in all of this other information about what has taken place. Like if you only look for the last 100 years, you might believe when you visit Lekwungen territory for the first time that camas meadows are these incredible naturally occurring seas of purple blue flowers. But as you start to extend your timeline, you start to realize that, in fact, those meadows are often the responsibility of particular families, and that they are marked with stones, and that they have received care through the application of fire and through the tending of the actual bulbs themselves, then all of a sudden that changes the whole story that we're telling about how these places work, about who humans are. And I think that it also forces us to rethink some of the policy decisions that we're making.
Yeah. And I'll just echo something that Marco said in the episode and what you were, I think, getting at the beginning too, that these rock walls are so massive and incontrovertible as that kind of evidence, right? They are so present on the landscape, at least where we can still see them, right?
Yeah.
Where they haven't been buried by the oceans or hidden in the trees.
Yeah.
Right? There's just no denying it at this point.
Yeah, one of my friends and colleagues, Darcy Matthews, he talks about these places as being monumental and, should be considered among the other great stone creations of the world because we have these rock walls that are, 20 meters wide in some instances and nearly a kilometer long. And you come out for a low tide and you add some rocks to that wall and you have a new appreciation for just how many people and how much love and effort and investment in the future went into these places.
Do you have a general call to action to people? When people say, I love this, how do I get involved? Where do you send them?
I think this harkens back to one of your earlier questions too about like what space is there for people in clam garden restoration or sea garden restoration. And I think there's all sorts of space. I think that it's really exciting to look at where you're living and find opportunities to connect with the lands and the people of the place that you are now. I feel like that's the best place to start. And if those places are places where there are clam gardens, one of the things that excites me so much is that there are nations up and down the coast who are starting clam garden revitalization work for all sorts of different purposes. So there's more and more work that people can get involved in.
I am curious how you came to get involved with this whole world. What was your introduction to sea gardens like?
Oh, I love this question. So I grew up in the Cowichan Valley in the homelands of my mother's family. And my grandma grew up on a little tiny island just off of Chemainus Bay. And our family were all fishermen. They had oyster leases and she grew up clam digging. So by my generation, our family had largely moved out of fishing, and my family is now composed of many, many artists, actually. But during my undergrad, I knew I wanted to do something about the care for and love of our oceans. And I happened to get a job at Gulf Islands National Park Reserve for a summer as a summer student when I was 19. And the purpose of my job was to learn as much as we could about these places called clam gardens. And at the time, there wasn't very much that had been written about them. But I did get to spend all of this time on our beaches, the beaches in my territory, and with elders from my community. And so when we were visiting these places, I got to learn so much more about them, both from our ways and our perspective, and also I got to learn about the ecology of these places. By the end of that summer, I had heard such a clear vision articulated that our clam beaches aren't healthy like they used to be, that clams and shellfish were foundational to the food security of our peoples and to the economy of our peoples, and that if we want our oceans to be okay, we need to be paying attention to bringing our clams back, and that the best way to do that is to bring our people back onto beaches and back into these ecosystems again, to care for them as they've been cared for since time immemorial. I took those as my marching orders. I was like, okay, we need to figure out a way to make this happen. And so that's really dictated the last 15 years of my life.
How have you gone about it? How have you been getting people back onto beaches?
Well, so I had the enormous privilege of working on clam gardens in a number of different capacities. I got to do that as a student researcher, and then I worked at Northwest Indian College on the Lummi Reservation and got to do more work with clam gardens and other food systems, Coast Salish food systems there. And then I had the incredible privilege of being the clam garden project manager for the first restoration project that happened at Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. I was helping lead that work and facilitate that work for the first kind of 6 years of that initiative. And now I'm just wrapping up my doctoral studies that is looking at what has happened now that we've begun doing that. And through that time, we've developed the Clam Garden Network, which we're just in the process of formalizing.
Tell me about the network, because I didn't get to include this in the episode, but I think it's it's an amazing thing that you've created. What does it offer to do?
Yeah, so the Clam Garden Network has really been a project like off the sides of many of our desks for a long time. And that's just what we're in the process of shifting. And it's a collaboration of community members and scholars, ecologists and archaeologists, and resource managers who are interested in communicating about and uplifting clam garden work in various different capacities. And so sometimes that looks like engaging in education opportunities. One of the things that I am really excited about personally with this shift into formalization, and one of the places I hope we can go, is I've been really inspired by work by KUA, the Fish Pond Network organization in Hawaii. Every year they gather in a different community to work together on a different fish pond. And so each fish pond family has their own styles of building rock walls, and they have their own reasons for restoring fish ponds. And so every year they learn from a different family and they go and visit that place. And I think that it would be incredible if we were able to do something like that with clam gardening on the coast here. And now I'm really excited to be able to continue to serve my people and hopefully support the growth and resurgence of Indigenous food sovereignty in this area and around the Pacific through a new position at the Center for Indigenous Fisheries and through the Indigenous Aquaculture Collaborative. Because while clam gardens, as Quoxie Stala described them, only exist in this part of the world, like you talk about in the episode, like many people talk in the episode, sea gardening more broadly is a practice that is shared by Indigenous communities all over. And we garden all sorts of different species in all sorts of different technological ways, depending on the conditions, the community conditions and the ecological and geological and oceanographic conditions that are present in each of our places.
Yeah. This is actually, I think, my personal favorite thing about this story is the international relations aspect. It's so cool. And I mean, you can't exactly say it's a uniquely modern phenomenon because there was, huge networks of information before, but it's happening maybe bigger and faster than it ever has before. And it's so inspiring to see these networks spring up and share knowledge and just, all this generosity and incredible kind of generative potential for the future. It makes me really, really excited.
Yeah, I think it's really inspiring. And I think that, part of what we're doing is trying to revive ancestral kinship pathways. So we used to have big ocean navigators who would travel long distances. And one of the clam gardens that we've been working on is on a place that's now called Russell Island. And that island for the last several generations has been caretaken by a family that is of Coast Salish and Hawaiian descent. So there's all of these kinship networks that we're able to start reviving as we bring our people to work together once again.
That's incredible. And I didn't know that about Russell Island.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah. The Mahoy family has a really long-standing history there.
Wow. Back to what you were saying about kind of timescales and how this whole place has a human fingerprint on it. And speaking about Russell Island in particular, and this sort of like this drive to do science on sea gardens, and something I was speaking with Joe about, it's sort of like, well, what is a control here? What is a space that you can say compared to what, right? Like you only in the sense of the last couple hundred years maybe of untended spaces, but those are still affected by their legacy. Yeah.
And even when we're talking about beaches that don't have walls on them, the places that we're often talking about are part of these cultural sea garden seascapes. Because, when you think about being a part of an ecosystem, you don't have places that are next to your villages that aren't being looked after. Yeah. And so I'm really excited to watch that conversation continue. I think we started to touch on this, but there are many reasons that these places require so much restoration today, and why our beaches are in such different condition than they used to be. So part of that is the removal of people, and we've talked a bit about that. But there are also some other really important factors that have happened in the last 100 or so years that have really changed clam communities and the condition of beaches, particularly throughout my territory. So some of those include forestry. Like, we have had such incredible forestry impacts, and when you pull a lot of logs off of beaches, you not only are changing hydrology and the erosion that's taking place. When little bits of the bark fall off of logs, that decomposes, and those decomposition processes can steal some of the oxygen from beaches, like Marco was talking about in the episode. And so it can increase some of the silts and like the really fine sands that prevent clams from getting enough food and oxygen and can kind of smother them. And we don't have a great sense for like quantifying the impacts of the forestry activity and logging that have taken place on the coast. And the other thing that has really shifted our clam beaches is that through the 70s in particular, I think it was for about 15 years, there was clam fisheries in the 1900s were not managed as carefully or as closely as a lot of other industries were. And people started barging out hydraulic hoses that they would use to wash beaches away. And so when you're fishing this way, you're changing the sediment structure of your beach, and you're also able to take almost every single clam that exists there, regardless of species and regardless of size. And so when we're trying to bring back beaches today, that's going to be easier in some places than others, because some places the sediment conditions have been shifted so dramatically that they're going to require a lot more care. And I don't know that in all instances we know exactly how to bring all of those places back again. There are other places, though, that still have a lot of the ideal conditions for clams and other species to live, and they just require more adults, for instance, to be present, like more large clams there that can spawn and bring all the babies back.
Adult clams.
Adult clams.
Maybe
we need adult clams.
Adult people too.
Yeah, adult people perhaps too, and kids, but also adult clams.
Yeah. How do we make sure there's more adult clams there? Like, how do you kickstart that process?
Ancestrally, we would transplant them. We would transplant them from one part of a beach to another part of a beach, or from a site that's doing really well to a site that's needing more help. Fisheries law in Canada doesn't actually allow us right now to take animals out of the water and place them back in the water. We're only allowed to take animals out unless they've come from a hatchery.
That's so bizarre. That's unbelievable. I mean, it is sadly believable, but damn. And like you're saying with the forestry connection, which I'd never heard before, and it makes all the sense in the world. None of these things are in isolation.
Right. Including
the policy, right? Like all this tangled web of policy that clam gardens moving forward have to either fit into or, be the vanguard of change. Right? That's not a very good way of saying that, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. Yeah. And I think that, there are more and more communities who are choosing to assert their sovereignty and issue their own decisions about the care and the well-being of their lands and their people and their waters, because, it's our children and it's our grandchildren that are going to be here and that are going to be affected.
Do you feel like it is a case of perhaps it's better to ask forgiveness than permission for a lot of nations in the condition of wanting to bring back their sea gardens?
I think it's essential. The courts are demonstrating again and again that we have unceded rights and governance authorities over our territories. And a part of that is bringing back the governance, and a part of that is issuing our own decisions. And I think that how we do that within our own communities is something that matters to us internally. I also think that there is a place, and perhaps this is also a place where people who are excited about supporting this type of work can really have a big role. I think there's a really important place to educate the general public and to change policies, because when we're uncovering it might seem like we're uncovering these little kind of pieces of red tape, but they are just like the edges, the fraying edges that are actually the systemic exclusion of our people from our rights and our territories and the suppression of our practices and our governance. And so I do think that conversations around changing policies, and whoever is, empowered to be able to do that, excited to do that, feels like their position is that, whether that be nations, whether that be nation supporters or some of the nonprofits that we're working with, I think that work is also really important. And I think changing the conversation more broadly is a big part of that.
Yeah, I think clam gardens have a strong potential being exactly that thing that so many people can rally behind to be that change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope so too. And I do think that is like a big kind of entry point, because there are so many places, like when you think about clams as being the interface between our lands and our waters, like you can't have clean clams that are safe to eat if you don't think about what you're doing on the land. You don't think about where your stormwater is coming from and what we're flushing down our toilets. It's all so connected. And so there's a place for everyone in this work.
Yeah, it's a perfect illustration of that intersection in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Maybe I'll just say this one thing, and maybe it'll make it in, maybe it won't. But I think one of the things that is interesting and perhaps exciting, and I feel like indicative of the fact that this work is not done and is long-standing, is that there are many characters in this story. Like your episode so perfectly illustrates so many of the different characters, the different languages and the different organisms and plants and rocks and mountains that all have a place in this story. And the systems that we have today are missing some of those main characters. And so I think one of the main characters that has really been highlighted are people. And that's one thing that my work has strived to really start to correct. But there are many other characters who are still missing from this story. And so, in some places that includes octopus, in some places that includes urchins, in some places that includes moon snails. And so I think that thinking about, who the characters are that we have at our table or at our beach is important. And I'm excited to see more and more of those characters return.
That's so beautiful. How could I not keep that in? That's incredible. Skye, thank you so much for your time and for your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity, Mendel. It's been a pleasure.